Hi there, today I'm going to be walking you through webhooks in Marketo, and I'll show you how they're set up, how you can use them in different use cases, and how to debug them if you're getting issues. So webhooks are a powerful way that you can interact with third-party systems to either retrieve information from those systems or to make updates to those systems. So some examples of where I've used webhooks in the past are for sending messages to Slack from Marketo, triggering a workflow to run in Zapier, sending SMS messages from Marketo, routing leads using Chili Piper, and then enriching leads with phone number lookup information. So there are plenty of different use cases for webhooks, and I'll go through a few of them throughout the course of this video, but these are just a few examples of how powerful webhooks can be to unlock functionality that you can't typically get with Marketo. So let's take a look at the configuration of a typical webhook in Marketo. So using this example here, we can see that there's always a URL field, and this is specified by the third-party system. This is where you're going to send the payload of your webhook to. And as we'll see later on in this post, this URL can even contain lead tokens. So in this example here, where we're doing a phone number lookup, the URL actually contains the person's phone number, and we pull that in using the lead.phoneNumber token. Then the payload template will depend on the information you're trying to send via the webhook, and this can contain lead tokens as we do here, or it can contain trigger tokens as we see here, and it can also contain campaign description tokens, which I'll get into a bit later on in this post. Then we've got the request token encoding option. This is usually set to none. However, if you're using special characters like ampersands, which are being pulled in using tokens within either the payload template or the URL, then you might need to use token encoding. What I recommend doing is starting with it set equal to none, and then if you're getting errors related to invalid payloads or issues with the URL that you're sending to, then you can try experimenting with either setting the token encoding to JSON or form URL, and which of these you select should be determined by the third-party documentation. They should tell you what format they expect the data to be in, so that will allow you to choose either of these. So you should only need to do this if you're using tokens within the payload and if these tokens contain special characters like ampersands. And then we've got the request type of the webhook. So most often this will either be post, which means you're sending information to the system to make an update to it, or it can be a GET request where you're getting information from the system that you want to try and store in Marketo. There are other options like delete, patch, and put, but I haven't used these once in the 3+ years I've been using Marketo, so they're very rare. And then the final thing we need to select is the response type. This only matters if you intend on using the information that's returned by the webhook and potentially storing it in a Marketo field, as I'll show a bit later on. And if you want to know what this is, again, consult the third-party documentation, and they should tell you whether the information they're going to send back to Marketo via the webhook will be in JSON or XML format. And then the last part of webhook configuration is sometimes you might need to specify a custom header to let the third party know some extra information about the webhook. So most often this is used to provide authorization to let the third party know that you've got the necessary authorization to make the request. Or it can include parameters like the content type to let the third party know what content you're sending over. And I have an example of that somewhere here, bear with me. So here we send the content type and we put that in the custom header to let the third party know that we're going to be sending over information in the JSON format. And if you need to create a custom header for a webhook, you click this, set custom header, and then you can add all the parameters that you need. You specify the header name and then the value, and then you just click save. And creating a webhook is as easy as filling out all these fields, which you've already gone through: the URL, where you're going to send the information to, the request type of your webhook, the template contains the information you want to send to the URL. Then you can either request token encoding, and then you have to set the response type as well as setting the request type. So that's how you can set up a webhook in Marketo and set up a custom header. Now in the next part of this, we're going to go through how you can use tokens within either the URL or the payload template of your webhook. So this is the first example of where you can use tokens from Marketo within the payload template. So this is a webhook that sends information from a form fill to Zapier to start a workflow. And we can pull in all the informations that the person submits to the form using lead tokens. That's one example. Other tokens you can use within the URL. So you can also use lead tokens within the URL. You can use trigger tokens too. You can pull those in. And then finally, you can also use campaign description tokens. So I use this. This is a webhook that sends SMS notifications to people from Marketo using the Telnex telecommunications platform. And the way this works is in the description, I put the text that I want to be in the SMS body in the campaign description. And then in the webhook, I pull this in using the campaign description token. This way, I only need one webhook to be able to send different SMS bodies using different smart campaigns. If I wasn't using this campaign description token, then I'd need a different webhook for each SMS message that I want to send. But now, by being able to put the SMS message within the campaign description, I can have one webhook and then change the message that's being sent by the webhook by having different smart campaigns with different descriptions within those smart campaigns. And then similarly, I've done the same thing with the Chili Piper webhook. So this webhook is responsible for routing people within Salesforce when they're created. And to specify the router to Chili Piper, I use the campaign description token. So instead of having a different webhook for each Chili Piper router, I can have one webhook for Chili Piper, and then I can change the router that is being requested by specifying the router in the campaign description name. So once again, you can save on the number of webhooks you're creating by using the campaign description token. Now, the next thing I'm going to go through is how you can store information returned from a webhook in Marketo fields. So this webhook looks up a person's phone number, and then the Telnex telecommunications platform sends information back about that phone number, like what the country code is, what city, what's the line type of the phone number, and what state the phone number is registered in. And in order to get these values into Marketo fields, we use the response mappings section down below. So in here, you can add more response attributes and then map them to Marketo fields. Instead of setting the end fields or the desired fields in here directly, I recommend using temporary fields. And the reason for this is because sometimes a webhook can return a 200 response code, but the result can be empty. So I've had issues in the past where this happened and fields that were populated were being overwritten because the webhook returned an empty result. So that's the danger. That's the danger of using the end fields or the desired fields in here directly, because if these webhook response values come back as empty, then they could overwrite these fields. So what I recommend doing is using temporary fields, like these dummy fields I have here. And then in your smart campaign, you're going to call the webhook, and then you're only going to set the desired field if the field from the webhook, the temporary field, is not empty. So here we can see that the country code value is being stored in the dummy field, which is the temporary field. And then in the smart campaign, we check if dummy is not empty, then store the value of dummy in the country code field using the lead.dummy lead token. And then we do the same here. We can see that city is being stored in dummy 2. So then we'll only transfer the value of dummy2 to the desired city field if dummy2 is not empty. So I recommend you take this precaution in order to avoid the scenario where populated fields are being overwritten by webhook responses. I've had this happen to me in the past, and if it does happen to you in the course of you testing webhooks or whatever, you can use the Marketo bulk API, and I've written a post on this. You can use the Marketo bulk API to change a field back to its original value across a bunch of leads very easily. So instead of you manually having to click into each lead, look at their activity log to see what the old value was and what the new value is, and setting that field back to the old value, you can use the Marketo bulk API to change that field back to the original value in bulk across a bunch of leads very easily. So check that out if you ever need to make wholesale changes like that to a field. And one note I make as well is these temporary fields that you're using here, ideally they're not being set by any other Marketo Smart campaigns or webhooks, because that just might interfere with what's going on here. So if something changes it after the webhook runs, then you could be setting this country code value to an incorrect value. So that's why I recommend having these dummy fields or these temporary fields only being set by one webhook, so there's no interference from other campaigns or webhooks. Okay, so let's get to the fun part. I'm sure, like anyone who's ever used both Marketo and Salesforce, you wish that Marketo had formula fields like Salesforce does. And it's unfortunate that Marketo haven't done this, but there is a workaround, and it's using the Whoosh Marketing Excel calculator via webhook. So I have an example here where you make a request to the Whoosh Excel URL, you specify your username and your password, and then any Excel formula that you put in the payload template will be evaluated and then returned in the result response attribute. And this becomes really powerful because we can use tokens within the payload template to pull in field values and then run calculations on these fields and store the output in another Marketo field. But as I mentioned before, instead of storing the result in the desired field right away, use a temporary value like these ones here, and then transfer those temporary values to the desired fields if they're not empty. So that will avoid issues where you're overriding populated fields with empty result values. And it's worth noting here that even though we're receiving information from Whoosh, the request type is post, and we set request token encoding to be form URL as well. I'm pretty sure that's specified within the Whoosh documentation, so just make notes of that. And also be aware that I've run into this issue before where two formulas that are the exact same will have different outputs in Google Sheets and Excel. So just make sure that you always test your formula in Excel first, because I happen to be a Google Sheets man, and I made the mistake once of testing a formula in Google Sheets, but then when I put it in Marketo and it went to Whoosh to be evaluated by the Excel calculator, it gave a different answer than I was expecting, and I had to do a whole lot of cleanup. So I always recommend testing your Whoosh formula in Excel or some online Excel calculator so you know exactly what the result will be and that it is as expected. That being said, I am a Google Sheets fan, and I'd love to see a Google Sheets equivalent to Whoosh. So this might be a project I explore in the future. So if you're interested in seeing that, then fill out this form here and I'll keep you up to date if I make any progress in this area. And something else worth mentioning here is the FlowBoost tool. So this allows you to run JavaScript calculations. So similar to Whoosh, you can use Marketo tokens within the payload template within your JavaScript code. That gets calculated and then the response gets stored in the result attribute. So you can do all sorts of complex things with field values using JavaScript computation and store the result. Once again, I'm a bit of a contrarian here. My Python skills are a lot stronger than my JavaScript skills. And I'm also thinking about a Python calculator similar to FlowBoost. So if this is something you'd like to see, again, stick your name down and I'll keep you up to date if I ever make any progress here. Okay, so we've talked a lot about setting up webhooks and all the cool things you can do with them, but what happens when they go wrong? And one thing I've noticed is actually quite annoying is that sometimes there seems to be a lag where I'll update the payload template of a webhook, but then when I re-trigger the smart campaign to send the webhook, it's still sending the old payload template. So what I recommend doing in those cases, I want this smart campaign. So using the example of Slack test, if we make a change to the payload template here, and then we re-trigger the smart campaign, and we see that Marketo is still sending the old payload template, what we should do is we should clone this webhook, as I've done here, make the change to the payload, and then pull in the cloned webhook in here, and then re-trigger this smart campaign to run, and then that will send the cloned webhook with the new payload template. And if this works and you're done testing, then you can just keep this cloned webhook and delete the original, and then you can rename this cloned webhook. However, if you have more testing to do, let's say for example now we update the payload template of the cloned webhook, but Marketo is still sending the old payload template, then same as before, we'll go back to Slack test, we'll make the change in the payload template here, then we'll pull in Slack test back into the smart campaign. We'll re-trigger this smart campaign to run, and now this will send Slack test with the new payload template. So this is a way around the lag or payload templates not updating. You can just keep alternating between the original webhook and the cloned webhook and changing the payload templates between them in order to do your testing. I've complained to Marketo about that issue, but unfortunately I don't think there's been any progress made there, so you can always use that trick in the meantime. And then a bit more difficult of an issue to solve is getting vague error messages about invalid payloads. So the way I recommend going about debugging this scenario is, I'll start by showing you the use case. So we'll have someone fill out a contact sales form, and if you want to find out what's going on here with this CAPTCHA normalized score, then I've got a post on my site that walks through Marketo's integration with Google V3 reCAPTCHA. So you can check that out if you want more information. Jeez, I've been posting a lot lately. Here you go. So you can check out that post if you want to find out more about what's going on with this smart campaign trigger constraint. So then in the flow here, we call the webhook Slack inbound form fills other to send a message to Slack. And then I've got two smart campaigns, one that listens for failure. So when the webhook response is not okay. And I've got another one that looks for successful responses. And then in the flow, I send, in this case, the successful email. And in the flow of the failed, I send an alert to myself with the failed email template. And these templates are identical. They both contain the payload template of the webhook, but the subject line is different. So here it says webhook payload successful, and here it says webhook payload failed. So when these all reach your inbox, it'll be easier to distinguish the webhook payloads that were successful and those that were not. And if you want, you can copy them into a Google Sheet so you can see them side by side. And to make it easier to distinguish between the two, I recommend creating two folders. one for the successful webhooks and then one for the failed webhooks, and then create a filter in your email inbox. So this filter, for example, it looks for the subject line webhook payload successful, and then it's going to move them into the successful webhooks folder, and then you can create another one which looks for webhook payload failed, which will put them in this folder. So then when you come to your inbox, all the webhook requests are neatly filed away in one of these two folders, and then you can put all the successful ones in one column in a Google Sheet, and then you can go to failed webhooks and take all of those and put them in another column of a Google Sheet so you can have them side by side for easy comparison. And then just to show you what one of these webhooks looks like in my inbox, so we can see that all the information is, all the lead tokens have been populated here. So then I'll look at this for successful ones and I'll compare to the failed ones and see what the difference is. And one thing to note is, if you're looking for failed webhooks, you can also use the error type constraint and filter on particular errors when sending your emails. And that brings me to filters. So there's a few different filters you can use for webhooks. So if you want to find people who've had successful webhook calls, you can use response is okay. If you want to find people who've had unsuccessful webhook calls, you can use response is not okay. And then you can also filter on particular error types. So if you're trying to find people who've had failed webhook sends with a particular error type, you can use this. You can use this constraint here. One other tool that you can use for helping your debugging is Postman. So in order to verify that the issue is not with the payload you're sending, you can send the exact same payload with Postman, and if it's successful, you know that the issue is not with the payload, but it's with the way that Marketo is sending it. So an example of this is, if you've got a webhook in Marketo that sends a message to Slack, you can take the payload template from Marketo, put it in Postman, and then send the exact same information using Postman. And if it's successful, then you know that your payload template is good, and then it's an issue within Marketo. And to help you in assessing whether your payload template is correct, you can use online validators. So if you consult the third-party documentation and it says that the information you're sending to it needs to be in JSON format, then you can look up an online JSON validator like this one here. And if it's a good one, it'll also tell you where in your text you've gone wrong. So you can see here that it's pointing out that this line here does not conform to standard. So that's what you need to change. And then finally, we'll get to a bit of a trick here, because normally you can only call webhooks from trigger smart campaigns within Marketo, but there is a hack you can do to call them from batch campaigns. So what you need to do is set up a requestable smart campaign. Note that this has to be requestable because executable campaigns cannot call webhooks. So it must be a requestable campaign. In the flow, we're going to call the webhook. And then in our batch campaign, so this is just a very simple batch campaign that will run for my email address. All we need to do is just request this requestable campaign, and then the requestable campaign, when it's requested, will send the webhook for us. So that's a hack to how you can send webhooks using batch campaigns. And that brings me to the end of the post. And before I go into some example use cases that you should check out, I do have a post on executable versus request campaigns. So if you want to understand a bit more about them, then you can check that out. And now that you're fully equipped and hopefully you understand how Marketo webhooks work in depth, you can check out a few different use cases, like how you can send messages to Slack for form fills, how you can trigger a Zap to run within Zapier, how you can send SMS reminders to your customers for webinars, how you can route leads within Salesforce using Chili Piper, and how you can enrich leads using phone number lookups. And I'll have future posts coming on how you can use webhooks for enriching leads with Clearbit information or Crunchbase information. So subscribe to me here on YouTube if you want to know when those posts get released, or come into my blog and you can subscribe here as well. And then the last point I'll make is, you mightn't have realized it, but when you're using webhooks to interact with these third-party systems, you're actually interacting with their APIs. And APIs are very powerful for unlocking extra functionality, as we've seen in this video. And they can also help facilitating automation. And they've really helped to streamline a lot of my marketing operations workflows within Marketo. So if you want to learn a bit more about API requests and Marketo's own API, and how you can use this to facilitate automation and streamline your Marketo workflows, then you can check out the Marketo API Quick Start Guide. So thanks for your attention here today. I hope this post was useful. And if you have any questions, please comment on the video here on YouTube, or you can comment here on the blog post. And I'll put a link to this blog post, Marketo Webhook Guide with examples, in the description of the YouTube video, so you can check that out. Thank you.